She kicked me out of the house the morning after my husband's funeral. She said she didn't have to pretend anymore. At the will reading, she looked at me with a calm smile and said I would go back to where I came from with nothing. Then the lawyer opened the final envelope. Before I continue my story, tell me where in the world you're listening from, and follow the channel to hear more stories like mine. Everything happened right after my husband's funeral. The house didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a shrine. The curtains were still closed from the night before. The smell of flowers was everywhere. Lilies, roses, things meant to honor the dead, but that only made the air heavier. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was thick, suffocating, like grief had soaked into the walls. My husband had been buried less than a day earlier. I woke up fully dressed, curled on the edge of the bed we used to share. I hadn't slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, not sick, not pale, just the way he used to look at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. The house creaked as someone moved down the hallway. Her, my mother-in-law. She had lost her only son, and she wore that loss like armor. Her eyes were swollen, red from crying. Her shoulders were tense, drawn inward, like she was holding herself together by force alone. Anyone looking at her would have seen a grieving mother, and they wouldn't have been wrong. But grief doesn't make people kind. My head felt heavy when she stopped in front of the door. I lifted my face and our eyes met. She looked distant, composed in a way that felt almost rehearsed. She hadn't hugged me once at the funeral, even though we had stood side by side at the casket, close enough to touch, miles apart in every other way. She stood there for a few seconds, long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable, before finally speaking. "I can't stand you." My chest tightened. Of all the things I imagined she might say, anger, tears, even silence, a declaration of pure contempt at 7 in the morning hadn't been one of them. "I tried to tolerate you for his sake," she continued, her voice steady. "Robert wanted us to live under the same roof, to keep the peace, but he's not here anymore, and I can't endure even one more second of seeing you in front of me." She took a breath, as if she was the one being reasonable. "I'm 65 years old, and I'm done tolerating things I don't want. You need to leave. By tomorrow." After she said that, I lowered my head and laughed. Not because it was funny. The sound slipped out of me, short, dry, broken, the kind of laugh that comes from disbelief and sheer desperation, from realizing that reality has crossed a line your mind hasn't caught up with yet. Her expression hardened immediately. "Do you find this amusing?" I lifted my face slowly. My throat burned, my eyes stung, not from tears, but from exhaustion, the kind that seeps into your bones. "Amusing?" I repeated, my voice unsteady. "You buried your son yesterday, and this morning you're throwing his wife out of his house? No, it's not amusing. It's surreal." I stood up suddenly, my body moving before my thoughts could catch up. The words poured out of me, tangled and raw, as if they had been waiting years for permission. "I stayed when no one else did. I took you to your appointments. I cooked when you couldn't get out of bed. I kept this house running while Robert worked himself into the ground. I helped turn this place into a home. You didn't do that alone. I was here every single day. I held your son when he broke down. I held you when he nearly died the first time. Lower your voice," she interrupted, far too calmly. "There's no need to shout." That landed harder than any insult. "I'm not shouting at you," I said, my hands trembling now. "I'm trying to understand how someone can be this cold, less than 24 hours after—" "There is," she said, taking a small step back. "That aggression, that intensity." I stopped. "Aggression?" I echoed, stunned.
I'm in shock. My husband died yesterday. And I lost my only son, she replied, firm and composed. That doesn't mean I lose control. She crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe like someone observing a volatile situation from a safe distance. I can't live with this kind of behavior in my house anymore. I need peace. And you, she gestured vaguely, as if searching for the right word, you make everything harder. Something tightened in my chest, sharp and unmistakable. Harder? I whispered. I'm harder? You've always been too much, she said quietly. Robert tried to balance things, but now I don't have to pretend this works. Pretend. The word hung between us, and something inside me shifted, not into anger, but into clarity. So that's it, I murmured. You never tolerated me. You only endured me because of him. She didn't deny it. I tried, I really did, but now I need to think about myself. At my age, I don't have to keep accommodating what makes me uncomfortable. She exhaled as if closing a difficult conversation. You have until tomorrow. There was no apology, no hesitation, just the quiet certainty of someone who had made this decision long before that morning. She turned and walked down the hallway, leaving the door open behind her. I stood there, shaking, surrounded by a house that no longer wanted me. And in that moment, even more than losing my husband, I understood something far worse. This wasn't just about grief, it was about power, and about who is allowed to lose control and who is never permitted to feel anything at all. I stayed where I was for a moment, listening. A door closed, not slammed, closed properly, then another, then the unmistakable sound of a lock turning, once, then again. I stepped into the hallway just as she came out of the guest room. She held a small ring of keys in her hand. My keys. I recognized the worn leather loop immediately. Robert had given it to me years ago, joking that it meant I officially lived there now. She didn't offer them back. You didn't need to lock that, I said. She tilted her head slightly, as if considering whether the comment deserved a response. This is still my house, she said calmly. I'm allowed to secure it. Secure it. From me. I followed her into the kitchen. She opened a drawer and placed the keys inside, then slid it shut with quiet finality. You don't need access to everything anymore, she added, turning back to the counter. It'll just complicate things. Complicate what? She began moving through the space like a curator reclaiming exhibits. My mail, stacked neatly on the corner of the counter, was gathered and set aside. She flipped through it once, then placed it on a shelf behind her. I'll sort through this later, she said. Anything important, I'll let you know. I felt something tighten in my chest. Elizabeth, I said carefully, I'm still here. She looked at me then, really looked at me. Her expression didn't change. Yes, she replied, for now. She opened the hallway closet and removed my coat from the front hook, folding it neatly over her arm before placing it deeper inside. My shoes were lined up by the door, toes facing outward, ready to be removed. Corrected. Let's not drag this out, she said, as if we were discussing logistics, not my life. It's better for both of us if we're efficient. Efficient. The word echoed unpleasantly. I tried the door to the study. Locked. That room was always shared, I said. It was, she agreed. And now it isn't. I stood there, my hand still on the handle, the reality settling slowly. This wasn't a conversation, it was a timeline. She moved past me again, heading toward the bedroom, our bedroom. I followed, panic rising just enough to sharpen my voice. You said tomorrow. You said I have until tomorrow. She stopped in the doorway and turned. You do, she said, but that doesn't mean nothing changes between now and then." She stepped inside and began removing things from the nightstand. My book, my reading glasses, the framed photo of Robert and me, taken on a random afternoon when we were both laughing at something off camera. She placed the photo face down in a drawer. "There's no need for dramatics," she said lightly. "This is just about boundaries." Boundaries. I felt humiliation creep in, slow and burning, not because she was yelling, because she wasn't, because she was so certain. She wasn't asking me to leave. She was making sure I understood I already had. By the time she walked away again, the house felt altered, smaller, less forgiving. Rooms I had lived in for years were no longer available to me. I stood there, keys gone, doors locked, my belongings quietly disappearing into places I could no longer reach. And I finally understood what she meant. Tomorrow wasn't an ultimatum. It was a deadline for my body to catch up with a decision that had already been made.
I waited until she went quiet. Not gone, just occupied elsewhere in the house. The television murmuring faintly through a closed door. The kind of sound meant to remind me I wasn't alone and wasn't in charge. I pulled the suitcase from the back of the closet. It looked smaller than it should have. Or maybe my life had grown larger than it ever learned to hold. I set it on the bed and unzipped it carefully, as if the sound itself might provoke correction. I started with clothes, practical things, things that could be justified. I folded slowly, deliberately. A sweater I'd worn 100 times, jeans that still carried the shape of my body. I realized as I placed them inside how little of what I owned had ever truly belonged to me. Most of it had been chosen to fit this house, this role, this arrangement. The drawers were full, the suitcase wasn't. Halfway through, I heard her pause in the doorway. I didn't turn around. She didn't speak at first, just watched. "You won't need that many," Elizabeth said finally, nodding toward the pile on the bed. "You're not going far." I swallowed. "I don't know where I'm going," I replied. "That's not my concern," she said evenly. "Just be reasonable." Reasonable. I removed one dress from the pile and folded it back into the drawer, then another. Each movement felt like an admission. In the bathroom, my things were already reduced, my toothbrush gone, my shampoo pushed to the back of the cabinet like an afterthought. I gathered what was left into a small canvas bag. It barely had weight. Elizabeth appeared again as I reached for the framed photo on the counter. Robert and me, arms around each other, both of us squinting into the sun. "You can't take that," she said. I froze. "It's a picture of my husband," I said quietly. "It's a picture from this house," she replied. "It stays." I set it down without argument. The absence of protest felt heavier than any fight could have. She watched me for another moment, then walked away. The furniture was never an option. The couch where we'd spent nights talking until too late. The dining table with the small burn mark from a candle left too close. The bookshelf Robert and I had assembled on the floor, arguing over instructions and laughing when we got it wrong. None of it had my name on it. I moved through the rooms like a guest tidying up before checkout, touching edges, memorizing textures, trying to understand where I had dissolved into the background. That was when I remembered the folder. Robert had insisted I keep copies of certain documents, just in case, he'd said, casual enough to make me laugh at the time. He'd handed me an envelope once, unmarked, and told me to put it somewhere safe. "Promise me," he'd added, unusually serious. I found it at the bottom of my bag, right where I'd left it months ago and forgotten. I didn't open it, not yet. I slipped it between two sweaters and zipped the suitcase closed. By the time I was done, it was barely full. I lifted it and felt the hollow echo of the weight. Years of marriage, years of work, years of care, reduced to what I was permitted to take. I wasn't packing memories. I was packing permission. Elizabeth stood in the hallway as I carried the suitcase out. She glanced at it, then at me. "That should be fine," she said. I set it by the door and looked back once more at the house. It stood, unchanged, confident.
Certain of its ownership. I realized then that I hadn't just lost a place to live. I had lost the illusion that I had ever truly lived there at all. I didn't think about where I was going until I was already driving. Chicago at night has a way of swallowing you. Streets blur. Landmarks lose meaning. I followed the first hotel sign I saw that didn't look like it would ask questions. The building sat off a side road, wedged between a closed laundromat and a gas station that hummed all night. One of the letters on the sign flickered. I didn't check which one. The room was small, clean enough, the bedspread stiff, patterned in colors chosen to hide wear. The air smelled like disinfectant layered over something older. I set my suitcase on the chair and stood there, unsure what to do next. There was no routine to lean on. At home, this would have been the hour Robert kicked off his shoes and asked if I'd eaten, even when he already knew the answer. Here, the silence didn't wait for me. It settled immediately. I lay down fully dressed. The mattress sagged unevenly. Springs protested when I shifted. Somewhere down the hall, a television laughed at jokes I couldn't hear. A door slammed. A voice raised and then disappeared. Sleep refused to come. I checked my phone, then again, then again. No messages, no missed calls. Not from Elizabeth, not from anyone. A part of me had expected something, a demand, an instruction, even a warning. Some acknowledgement that she had sent me out into the night with nowhere specific to land. There was nothing. Guilt crept in quietly, disguised as reason. Maybe I could have stayed longer. Maybe I should have kept my voice down. Maybe grief had made her cruel, and I'd made it worse by pushing back at all. Then confusion followed, the simple, disorienting question of where I belonged now. Not in theory, not eventually. Tonight. I imagined Elizabeth in the house, moving through rooms that no longer admitted me, locking doors, turning out lights, climbing into a familiar bed, safe in her certainty. The contrast was sharp enough to make my chest ache. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the cracks until they blurred together. My phone lay face down on the nightstand. I resisted the urge to turn it over again. That was when the words surfaced. Unwanted, but precise. Unclaimed. I wasn't just homeless. I was unclaimed. No place expected me back. No one was waiting to hear if I'd arrived safely. The world hadn't noticed my displacement at all. Near morning, I opened my suitcase and pulled out the envelope Robert had insisted I keep. I didn't open it. I just placed it on the nightstand, close enough to touch. It wasn't comfort. But it was proof that once, someone had thought ahead for me, and that was enough to get me through the night. The messages started before 8 the next morning. Short, direct, unconcerned with how the night had gone. "We need to handle some paperwork today. I'll need you to sign a few things. It's better if we don't delay." I stared at the screen, still sitting on the edge of the hotel bed. My shoes were on. I hadn't slept. The room felt temporary in a way I couldn't shake. I didn't respond.
10 minutes later, my phone rang. I let it ring once, twice. Then I answered. "I don't want this dragging on," Elizabeth said without preamble. "There are arrangements that need confirming." "What arrangements?" I asked. "The usual, formalities, waivers, things the lawyer will need." The word waivers caught my attention. I haven't spoken to a lawyer, I said. A pause, brief, almost imperceptible. Well, you will, she said quickly, soon enough. That's why it's important you cooperate now. Cooperate. She continued, her tone smoothing out. You're not entitled to anything beyond what's already been discussed. I want to be very clear about that so there are no misunderstandings later. Later than what? I haven't asked for anything, I said. I know, I'm just saying this to avoid confusion. After we hung up, another message came through almost immediately. Please bring identification. This should all be wrapped up before the will reading. I reread that line twice. Before the will reading. My chest tightened. She had never mentioned a date. No one had. The lawyer hadn't called yet. There was no reason for her to frame anything as before unless she knew exactly when after would be. I didn't respond. The calls kept coming. Missed call, voicemail, another missed call. Her voice in the messages was clipped now, the calm starting to thin. I just want to settle things cleanly, she said. There's no need to complicate this. Complicate for whom? By the afternoon, I spread the papers she'd emailed across the small hotel desk. Dense language, legal phrasing designed to exhaust rather than explain. Lines that asked me to confirm I understood my position. Lines that asked me to waive claims I hadn't known existed. She was trying to close doors, quickly. I picked up my phone and hovered over the screen, resisting the urge to confront her, to demand answers. Instead, I did something new. I paid attention. The pressure, the timing, the way she spoke as if outcomes were already set, as if my signature was the only loose end. People don't rush like that unless they're afraid of something. I set the phone down without replying. For the first time since Robert died, I felt something other than grief take shape. Not hope, suspicion. And with it, the quiet understanding that Elizabeth's certainty wasn't as solid as she wanted me to believe. I used to think Robert was just cautious, the kind of man who read contracts twice, who kept receipts long after returns were no longer possible, who believed in backups for his backups. I'd teased him for it more than once. Now, sitting alone in a hotel room with my phone face down and Elizabeth's messages unanswered, those habits rearranged themselves in my memory. They weren't quirks. They were preparation. There had been a conversation, months before he died, that I hadn't understood at the time. We were in the kitchen, late, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. If anyone ever pressures you to sign something, he'd said, casually rinsing a glass at the sink, don't. I laughed. That sounds ominous. He hadn't smiled. I mean it, he'd said, turning to face me, no matter who it is, no matter how urgent they make it sound.
I'd asked him what he was talking about. He shook his head, like he didn't want to give the thought more shape than necessary. Just promise me, he'd said. Another time, not long after, he'd been more specific. If my mother ever rushes you, he'd said quietly, not looking at me, stop. That's when you slow everything down. I'd defended her then, automatically. She was intense, yes, but she loved him. She meant well. Robert hadn't argued. He rarely did when he knew he was right. He also insisted I keep certain things separate, my own folder, my own copies, documents I assumed were duplicates, but which he labeled carefully, sliding them into an envelope he told me never to misplace. Just in case, he'd said again. At the time, it felt unnecessary, paranoid even. We were married, we lived together. What could possibly require separate records? Now I understood. Robert knew how his mother saw the world, in terms of ownership, hierarchy, who belonged where. He had grown up navigating that terrain. He had learned when to yield and when to prepare quietly for the moment yielding would no longer be enough. He never framed it as fear.
He framed it as respect for reality. There were other moments, too, questions he'd asked me that felt strangely forward-looking. Where I'd go if I ever needed space, whether I knew how to access our accounts without him, who I trusted outside the family. I'd answered lightly, brushing them off. We had time, we were fine. He hadn't corrected me. He just listened. And then there was the envelope. Unmarked, sealed, handed to me one evening without ceremony. Keep this somewhere safe. Don't open it unless you need to. Need to for what? I asked. He hesitated, just long enough. To be seen, he'd said. I hadn't understood that either. Until now. Robert never said it outright, but now I realized he had been preparing me, not to fight, to endure without disappearing, to recognize pressure for what it was, to trust myself when someone else tried to hurry me into erasing my own place in the story. Elizabeth thought she was the only one who understood how this would end. She was wrong. Robert had been writing his version quietly all along, and I was finally beginning to read it. The phone rang while I was sitting at the small desk by the window, staring at paperwork I hadn't signed. I almost ignored it. The number wasn't familiar, no name, no context, just a quiet vibration against the cheap wood surface. I answered anyway. Miss Williams, this is Daniel Harris. I'm calling from the law office handling Robert Williams's estate. He said my name correctly, fully, without hesitation. Yes, I replied, sitting up straighter without meaning to. I'm calling to inform you that your presence is required at a scheduled meeting later this week. Required? When? I asked. He gave me a date and a time. 2 days away, close enough to feel immediate, far enough to let my mind start working again. And the nature of the meeting? I asked. I'm afraid I can't discuss details over the phone, he said. All relevant parties have been notified. Relevant. The word landed differently than I expected. Solid. Anchoring. Elizabeth hadn't been mentioned once. Is there anything I need to bring? I asked. Just identification, he replied. Everything else has already been arranged. Arranged by Robert, I thought. The call was brief, efficient. He didn't offer condolences. He didn't ask how I was coping. He didn't soften his language or fill the silence with sympathy. And for the first time since Robert died, that felt like respect. When the call ended, I remained still, the phone warm in my hand. The room felt unchanged, the same thin carpet, the same muted traffic noise outside. But something inside me had shifted. Up until that moment, every conversation had been shaped around managing me, calming me, minimizing me, speaking slowly as if I might break. This wasn't that. This was procedural, equal, unemotional. I mattered because I was required to be there. That was the first time since his death that someone spoke to me like I mattered. I placed the phone face down on the desk and stood. My reflection in the window looked the same. Tired, drawn, carrying grief like weight I hadn't yet learned to redistribute. But there was something else now, too. Attention. The story was no longer being told entirely without me, and for the first time since Elizabeth told me to leave, I wasn't waiting to be managed. I had been called in. The law office was quieter than I expected. Neutral walls, soft lighting, a long table polished to a dull shine. Everything designed to feel orderly, impartial, as if structure alone could soften what was about to happen. Elizabeth was already there when I arrived. She stood to greet me, her face composed into something that resembled warmth. She wore black, carefully tailored, grief arranged into something dignified and presentable. "Rochelle," she said softly, reaching out as if to touch my arm, then stopping herself. "I'm glad you came." I nodded and took the seat across from her. I didn't return the gesture. I didn't need to. The lawyer entered a moment later, carrying a thick folder. He acknowledged us both with the same neutral courtesy, then sat and opened the file. He explained the process, the order, what would be read aloud, what would be summarized. His voice was steady, practiced, uninvested. Elizabeth folded her hands in front of her and lowered her gaze, the picture of restraint. The reading began. Accounts, assets, responsibilities. The house came early. Elizabeth's name followed immediately.
She exhaled, slow and deliberate, as if absorbing something heavy but expected. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her confidence sat quietly, already affirmed. I kept my eyes on the table. The lawyer continued, clause after clause, his tone unchanged. Property, control, authority. Everything that mattered placed squarely in Elizabeth's hands. At one point, she looked at me with something like pity. "She won't need much," she said gently, before the lawyer could move on. "Rochelle's always been adaptable." The lawyer paused, just long enough to register the comment. Then he continued. Another section passed, another confirmation of Elizabeth's role. "She'll be fine starting over," Elizabeth added, almost kindly. "She's young. She'll figure it out." My fingers curled slightly against my knee. I said nothing. The frustration didn't arrive all at once. It built gradually, sentence by sentence, omission by omission. Each time the lawyer's voice moved forward without my name attached to anything substantial, something tightened in my chest. This wasn't cruelty. It was erasure by procedure. Elizabeth sat taller as the reading went on. Not triumphant, settled. The posture of someone watching a prediction fulfill itself. She didn't look at me again until the lawyer paused and asked if there were questions. She shook her head immediately. "No," she said. "Robert was always very clear." Clear. I wondered what version of him she was remembering. The lawyer nodded and continued. By the time he reached the end of the primary document, my hands felt numb. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs with practiced ease. The performance of patience was no longer necessary. This was how it had always been meant to go. The lawyer closed the folder gently and placed it on the table. Elizabeth glanced at me again, this time with something like relief. It wasn't personal. It never had been. It was just confirmation. I felt the weight of it settle in, not as shock, but as resignation. The understanding that the system favored certainty, that ownership spoke louder than contribution, that love without documentation rarely survived translation into legal language. I prepared myself for the end, for the quiet dismissal, for standing up and leaving with exactly what I'd arrived with. For a moment, I thought she had won. The lawyer didn't stand when he reached for it. That was the first thing that felt wrong. Instead of closing the folder and signaling the end, he turned to the cabinet behind him and removed a single envelope, thicker than the rest, cream-colored, unmarked. Elizabeth noticed immediately. Her hand, which had been resting lightly on the table, tightened. This, the lawyer said, placing the envelope carefully in front of him, was submitted separately with explicit instructions from Robert Williams. Elizabeth frowned, just slightly. "I've already reviewed the will. I don't see what else there could be."
The lawyer didn't respond to her. He turned the envelope so the front faced me. My name was written across it in familiar handwriting. Rochelle. The ink slanted the way Robert's always had, heavy at the start of each letter, lighter at the end. The room shifted. Elizabeth's composure faltered for the first time. "What is that?" she asked. "An addendum," the lawyer replied calmly, "not attached to the primary will, intentionally." He slid it across the table. "For you." I didn't touch it right away.
My hands felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. My chest tightened, a pressure building that wasn't quite panic and wasn't quite relief. Elizabeth leaned forward. "This is highly irregular," she said. "If there was something else, I should have been informed." The lawyer met her gaze evenly. "The instructions were clear. You were not to be." Silence spread across the table. I broke the seal. Inside was a letter folded once. Beneath it, a stack of documents clipped neatly together. Copies, records, tabs marking dates and amounts. The lawyer waited until I unfolded the letter before speaking again. "Please read that first," he said. The paper trembled slightly in my hands. Rochelle. If you're reading this, then I didn't get the chance to explain everything myself. I'm sorry for that. My throat tightened. I took a breath and continued. I know how my mother can be when she feels threatened. I also know how the system works when people speak with confidence and expect others to step aside. Elizabeth shifted in her chair. The lawyer said nothing. This isn't about punishment, the letter continued. It's about record, about making sure no one can pretend you were just passing through. I looked down at the documents beneath the letter. Bank statements with both our names, receipts for renovations, notes in Robert's handwriting explaining who paid for what, time logs, spreadsheets, evidence of years of invisible labor. You helped build this life, he wrote, not just emotionally, practically, legally. If anyone ever tries to rush you into disappearing, slow everything down and let the facts speak. I swallowed. The lawyer cleared his throat gently. The addendum outlines Rochelle Williams's documented contributions to the household and to the property, financial and otherwise. Elizabeth shook her head once. That doesn't change ownership, she said quickly. The house has always been. The house, the lawyer interrupted, his tone unchanged, was refinanced during the marriage. These records establish joint contribution and shared equity. Elizabeth's lips parted, closed again. There is also, he continued, a trust established in Miss Williams' name, effective immediately. Its purpose is to prevent unilateral decisions regarding the sale, transfer, or control of shared assets. Elizabeth sat back sharply. That's impossible. It's documented, he replied, sliding one of the papers toward her. Her fingers hovered over the page but didn't touch it. You manipulated him, she said suddenly, turning toward me. The words came faster now, the calm thinning. You pressured him into this.
I looked up slowly. For the first time since I'd known her, Elizabeth Moore looked uncertain. I didn't, I said. My voice surprised me with its steadiness. He planned it. The lawyer continued, unmoved by the shift in tone. The addendum also includes a letter intended to be read aloud, should circumstances require it, he said, with your permission. I nodded. He took the letter gently and read. If my mother is present when this is opened, then she has already acted exactly as I expected. Elizabeth went still. She will have told you that you don't belong, that you are asking for too much, that speed and certainty are kindness. The room felt airless. They aren't. They're control. Elizabeth's face flushed. Rochelle is not a guest in this story. She is not temporary. She does not need permission to exist in the life we built. The lawyer folded the letter and set it aside. The silence afterward was different, heavier, charged. Elizabeth pushed her chair back slightly. This is outrageous, she said. You're making assumptions about my intentions. The lawyer looked at her evenly. The documents speak for themselves. She turned to me again, searching my face for something, anger, triumph, apology. I offered none of it. He didn't leave me comfort. He left me proof. The meeting ended shortly after that, Instructions were given, copies distributed, next steps outlined with careful precision. Elizabeth barely listened. As we stood to leave, she spoke one last time, her voice low. "You planned this," she said. "Both of you." "No," I replied. "He did." I gathered the envelope and held it against my chest, not protectively, groundedly. As I walked out of the office, I felt something unfamiliar beneath the grief. Stability. Not victory, not revenge, but the solid understanding that I had not imagined my place in that house, in that marriage, in that life. Elizabeth had rushed me because she had known, and now everyone else did too. Elizabeth didn't speak while we were still in the conference room. She waited. That too was a habit of control, letting authority leave first, choosing the moment she believed would work best for her. She followed me into the hallway as the lawyer stepped away to speak with his assistant. The space was narrow, lined with framed certificates and muted artwork meant to suggest credibility. "Rochelle," she said quietly, as if this were a private concern between reasonable people. I stopped walking. I didn't turn around right away. "This has all been very emotional," she continued. "Grief makes people misunderstand things, overreact." I faced her then. She searched my expression for cracks, found none. "You know Robert. He was generous, sometimes to a fault. He didn't always think through the consequences." The implication hung there, carefully placed. "That letter," she went on, lowering her voice, "it reads like something written under pressure. You must see how it looks. Manipulative. That was the word she didn't say yet." "I see how it reads, clearly." She nodded, encouraged. "Then you understand this doesn't have to go any further. We can revisit arrangements, adjust things, quietly." Bargaining.
The lawyer returned before she could continue. "Ms. Moore," he said politely, "we'll need to schedule a follow-up to discuss compliance timelines." Elizabeth turned to him, her tone shifting instantly. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said. "This entire situation was framed emotionally. I'm concerned Rochelle may have influenced Robert during a vulnerable period." There it was. The lawyer didn't flinch. "Mr. Williams's instructions predate his illness," he replied evenly. "They were reviewed and documented multiple times. The addendum is clear." Elizabeth's jaw tightened. "You're taking her word over mine?" she asked. "I'm taking the documentation," he said, "and the documentation supports her standing." The hallway felt suddenly crowded. A receptionist glanced over. Another associate paused nearby, pretending to review a file. Witnesses. Elizabeth noticed them too. She tried one last angle. "This house represents my entire life," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. "Rochelle came into it later. Surely you can see the difference." The lawyer nodded once. "And that difference has already been accounted for." Silence followed. Not awkward. Final. Elizabeth looked at me then, really looked at me, not with contempt, not with superiority, with calculation failing. "You're enjoying this," she said quietly. I shook my head. "No." That seemed to confuse her more than anger would have. "I'm done explaining myself. That's the difference." Her shoulders stiffened. She straightened her coat, gathering what remained of her composure. "This isn't over," she said. "It is," the lawyer replied before I could. "The terms are binding." She stepped back just slightly, enough to register. She thought she was taking something from me. She never realized what she was giving back. Not property, not money. Authority over my story. Elizabeth turned away without another word, her heels clicking sharply down the corridor. The sound echoed, then faded. I didn't watch her go. There was nothing left to witness. What she lost couldn't be retrieved, renegotiated, or reframed. She had built her power on certainty,
and certainty had abandoned her in front of people who would remember. I gathered my papers and followed the lawyer toward the exit. For the first time since Robert died, I wasn't carrying myself out of a room that had decided who I was. I was walking away with my place intact. And she knew it. I didn't make any sudden decisions after that. For days, I let things stay still. No boxes, no lists, no plans scribbled on scraps of paper. After weeks of being pushed, rushed, corrected, the quiet felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious, like I was waiting for someone to knock and tell me I was behind schedule again. No one did. When I finally moved, it was because I wanted to, not because I had to. I found a small apartment on the north side of the city. 1 bedroom, clean lines, afternoon light that stretched across the floor instead of stopping short. The kind of place that didn't pretend to be anything more than it was. I signed the lease without asking anyone's opinion. That alone felt like progress. Unpacking was uneventful. There were no dramatic moments, no tears over broken dishes or forgotten items. I placed things where they felt right. Books on a low shelf, a lamp by the couch.
The photograph of Robert went near the window, angled slightly, not framed like a shrine. He didn't need to be elevated to be remembered. He was already everywhere I stood steadily. Routine returned slowly, in pieces. Morning coffee in a mug I chose because it felt solid in my hand. Walks around the block just to learn the shape of the neighborhood. Groceries bought only for myself, which turned out to be simpler than I expected. There was relief in that simplicity. I noticed how often I paused before making small choices, as if waiting for correction. Which chair to sit in, which light to turn on, how loud the television should be. Each time I caught myself and kept going anyway. The habit of shrinking doesn't disappear overnight, but it does weaken when it's no longer rewarded. Grief didn't vanish, it changed texture. It showed up in quieter ways. In the instinct to reach for my phone when something unexpected happened. In the empty space beside me at night that no longer felt sharp, just present. I stopped fighting those moments. They didn't mean I was going backward. They meant I had loved someone deeply, and that love didn't require punishment to prove it was real. I thought about Robert often, not as a loss I needed to justify, but as a partner who had known me well enough to trust me with what came next. He hadn't tried to protect me from pain. He had respected my ability to survive it without erasing myself. That mattered. It reframed everything. Our marriage wasn't something that ended abruptly and unfairly. It was something complete, something that stood on its own terms. I didn't owe anyone an explanation for what it had been or what it had given me. Elizabeth never reached out again. There were no messages disguised as concern, no attempts at reconciliation. Through the lawyer, I learned she had complied with every requirement, slowly, precisely, without warmth. Each boundary observed because it could not be crossed. There was no satisfaction in that knowledge, only closure. She lost the ability to define me, to rewrite my place in the story, to decide whether I was temporary or expendable. That loss didn't need to be dramatic to be permanent. I didn't go back to the house. I didn't need to. What I had taken with me wasn't furniture or photographs or space. It was something harder to reclaim once lost. The understanding that I belonged to myself before I belonged anywhere else. One evening, months later, I stood by the window as the city settled into night. Lights came on one by one, conversations drifted up from the sidewalk and faded again. Life moving forward without ceremony. I rested my hand against the glass and breathed. Not because everything was fixed,
but because it no longer felt fragile. I wasn't waiting to be told where I could stand. I was already there, and this time I knew how to stay. Thank you so much for watching and staying with this story until the end. If it moved you, please click the like button. It really helps more people find stories like this. I'd also love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories like this, don't forget to hit subscribe. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.